Hello, welcome to Uncluttered, the podcast that discusses the connection between organizing and faith. So, our focus is not so much on the how to get organized, but why it's important from a biblical standpoint to leave the chaos and the clutter in our lives behind. I'm Angie Heitch. I'm an author and certified professional organizer living in East Tennessee.
And I'm Leanna George. I'm an author and former professional organizer living in Houston, Texas. Are you ready to unclutter your heart and your home so you can focus on what matters most? If so, let's dive in.
All right, so Leanna, starting off on this episode, you know me really, really well. You know all about loving to get on hiking trails and bicycle trails, love to travel, big time word nerd, author, reader, all that kind of stuff. But there's
Mhm.
two other nerdy categories that I'm not sure if you know about me. So, you got any guesses?
Uh, well, uh, not off the top of my head. I, I vaguely remember that you said that you had a science background. So
Yes.
to me, that's
That,
nerdy because math
yes.
and numbers don't do well with me, and next to that is science. So
Yeah.
yeah, so
Okay.
that's what that would definitely be one for me if you wanted to call that nerdy. Although the science people listening are going, no, it's not. And then yeah, I can't think of any what the other one might be. What is it?
Okay. All right. So yes, you got one of them, the science one, and that's going to be important in this episode a little later. But the other one is there are several categories of books and movies that I love that many people would probably consider nerdy, and one of them is Lord of the Rings. So
Mm.
I was introduced to the Lord of the Rings when I was in college dating Eric,
Hmm.
and I've read all the books at least once. I think Eric's read them all like 20 something times.
Oh wow.
Um, also Harry Potter, all that. But anyway, Lord of the Rings, the reason I'm mentioning that one is because there's a really, really good quote that is just perfect for this episode. So if you're into Lord of the Rings, then you might already know what I'm talking about. So are you into
Um,
Lord of the Rings?
yeah, I have watched the three movies,
Okay.
Lord of the
Well, there's
Rings.
more than three, but
Yeah, I know.
whatever.
I don't watch the prequel stuff. I think my
Okay,
husband's
got
more
it.
into that, and I don't watch all that, and definitely haven't read the books.
Oh my
Um, I do know, like the characters like Gandalf and
okay.
Sam and Frodo, and of
Yeah.
course Gollum,
Okay.
and that kind of stuff. So that's about really where my
Okay.
but I have watched the movies more than once. So
Okay. All right. Well, we can still be friends then.
oh,
Although
thank you.
you really are missing out on the books. They are just, oh my goodness,
Well,
they're
the
so
books
good.
are always better than the movies.
Always. Yeah. I think
Always.
I have only one exception to that in my whole life. But anyway, back to Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
The quote in the first book, The Fellowship of the Ring, is just so perfect when it comes to um, not having a cluttered schedule and having some margin in our life. So this is Bilbo, the original owner of the ring. Well, Gollum was actually, but well, anyway. So Bilbo is talking to Gandalf, and he says, "I am old, Gandalf. I don't look it, but I'm beginning to feel it in my heart of hearts. Why, I feel all thin, sort of stretched. You know what I mean? Like butter that has been scraped over too much bread. That
Mm,
can't be right. I need a change or something."
mm,
That resonates with me so much. The butter and the bread
mm,
specifically. So yesterday, I baked some bread. Well, day before. Anyway, so you get it out of the oven, it's still warm. Oh, and there's nothing better than to just get a big old pat butter and slather it on that warm bread and just, so it's just like dripping off the sides. Well, what if when I made my bread a couple of days ago and it comes out and I'm so excited, I realize that all I have is like a fourth of a pat of butter. There's nothing else
mm,
in there. And I'm trying to scrape that little tiny smidgen of butter over the bread. It's just not going to work. And so, in a similar way, when we have too many tasks on our to do list, too many events on our calendar, we are very stretched, just like that analogy with Bilbo. And I can honestly say that for most of my adult life, I have felt stretched that way. It's had some serious consequences, and the worst part is that I've brought most of this on myself.
yeah. Well, let me say that bread and butter resonates with me really well on my waistline, on my rear.
And real butter over margarine all the way.
Well, and we're talking about margin, but we could
Uh-huh.
also be talking margarine. So, bada boom. Okay, so going back to the topic, I do. I like that. I like the parallel you made, the analogy you made there, because it is. It's so, and I'm a visual person, right? And when I'm writing, I want to show versus tell. And that is just such a visual picture that, yeah, I am just like, I can hear the scrape of the knife against the toasted bread, just, scraping and just trying to get all of it I can. And it's just dry and there's
Mhm.
nothing there. And that's how it is when we have calendars and schedules that are, cluttered. And we talked about this a lot in episode 4 last time,
Mhm.
about how, we can do that. And so we're not going to talk so much about that, but now that we know that we're stretched thin, how do we declutter our schedule and how do we build that margarine or margin into our life?
Yeah. So, I can say now that, while this has been an issue most of my life, the past few years, I've been really making a concerted effort to get some of the clutter out, making some very difficult choices, some soul searching and prayer, and I'm in the best position I've been. I've still got ways to go, but I've been able to be more giving as far as my time and my priorities so that I can, well, like our podcast says, get rid of the clutter, shaping our hearts and home for what matters most. And it's been really, really just so worth that effort.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really great. That's really great. I know I looked at my calendar today and my to-do list and I was like, oh, there's not so much on there. And I was just, it was great. I mean, because I'm trying to build that margin into my life. So
Yeah.
how did you do that? How did you build that margin into your life? And how did you declutter? And what difference have you seen since you've been doing that?
Yeah. Okay. So when it comes to the how, I'm going to go back to my other nerdy category that you remembered, which was science.
Ah,
So,
okay, yeah.
yeah, so I got an undergrad in biology and a graduate degree as a pediatric PA, physician assistant,
Okay.
master's in medical science. So, spent a lot of time in the lab and looking at slides or dissections of different animals. We had some time in the cadaver lab in PA school. Oh my
Yuck.
God. I'm just going to have to say I miss the lab. I'm very nerdy in that way. And so being able to take that really focused look at whatever it was we were studying was really helpful. So I've used a similar kind of technique, not with a microscope or magnifying glass, but just to look at everything on my calendar, everything on my to-do list, and then see, does it match up? We talked about some of this in episode 4,
Yeah.
being able to make those good choices. But when we are able to do that, look in detail and then make those choices, the benefits are just, they're so wonderful having that margin in our life. And I think you can do that two different ways. You can either like be proactive looking ahead or you can look backwards. And both of
Mm,
them work. They're both helpful. So if you want to use the looking back, a good way to do that is to time track. So keep track of everything that you spend that time on and how much time. And oh man, that is a painful
mm,
exercise. One, because good grief, you got to record everything.
yeah.
And then 2, because then, like, at the end of a week's a good amount of time to do it, and you look and say, "Oh, okay, here's my priorities, let me get that out again, let me just examine. Oh, that doesn't really match up," you know? I'm
Yeah.
saying what's most important is this, but look how much time I spent surfing the internet or binging on Netflix or whatever it is that we're choosing
Right.
to spend time. The other thing we can do is be proactive and say, okay, so this is, let's say Friday might be a good day to look at my next work week or whatever day you choose. Let me look ahead, see what's on there right now. And then maybe you have to make the hard choice. Okay, well, I had planned that, but that really does not match with my priorities. Or maybe it does, but there's just too much.
Mm,
And you
yeah.
kind of know what you can handle and what you can't. And so, you just got to make those hard choices. But when we do, and we have some margin, and we're not 1/4 of a pat of butter trying to spread over a slice of bread, it's just a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that. I mean, peace is something we all want, right? And
Mhm.
we seek it, we want it, and so often we don't find it. But
Yes.
you know, we can if we will clear out some clutter and clear out some activity and clear out um, some of the things that we think that only we can do and let go of stuff, right?
Mhm.
And we can get that peace that we want. Listening to you talk about spending your time on things, and our priorities, it reminds me of the story of Jesus with Martha and Mary. You know,
Oh, yeah, that one that is just always gonna be a part of a discussion on time management, and let me say I've got a love-hate relationship with that story, but I'm glad you're bringing it up because it's
yeah.
important.
Well, because we want to always guide people to God's word about
Mhm.
whatever topic it is we're talking about, and this is a perfect example of somebody who was focusing on what was the most important thing versus letting the busyness of everything. And let me just read it first a little
Okay,
bit, and then we can dissect it and talk about it a little bit.
okay.
So this comes from Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. And it says, as Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. Her sister Mary sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he taught. But Martha was distracted by the big dinner she was preparing. She
Mm.
came to Jesus and she said, and I can just imagine her standing at the door with her hand on her hip, the broom in her hand, right? And she's just going,
Yeah.
Lord, doesn't it seem a little unfair to you that my sister is just sitting there while I do all the work? Tell her to come help me. And then, I can imagine Jesus. And I've always thought this about Jesus, that he went over to Jesus, goes, Mary, Martha, you're worried, upset over all these details. But I know Jesus wouldn't have talked like that. He loved Martha.
No.
And he went over to her and he just gently, lovingly said, dear Martha, you're worried and upset over all these details. But there's only one thing worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it and it will not be taken away from her. And
Mm.
so I think that when we look at this issue of time management and the busyness of our life, and um, how we, figure out what our priorities are, the story of Martha and Mary, because you can either be a Martha or you can be a Mary, right?
Mhm.
And I mean, and too many of us, I mean, there's always balance in life, right? I think that's the key, is finding how do you be a little bit of both Martha and Mary. But too many of us are too often Marthas, and we should probably try to be more like Mary.
Oh, yeah. I said I've got a love-hate relationship with the story because, oh, I'm just such a Martha. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
really a
Yep.
Martha. I am a worker bee. I am just like, get the task done. I am really big on fairness.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Yes.
seemed extremely unfair. I am working so hard and she is just sitting there being lazy. And then, Jesus calls her out. Was he harsh? I'm sure his tone was good. He had the best in mind, but good grief, it's not like she was sitting there just binging TV. Well, they didn't have TV, but she was making him dinner, you know?
Yeah.
He was doing something for him. And then here he goes and talks about how Mary chose what was better. And in Martha's mind, she's just lazy
Yeah.
sitting there. But when then we kinda just back up and not be defensive and be, "Well, wait, I'm a Martha." We do know that Jesus loved Martha and Mary and Lazarus. Later
Mhm.
on in the Gospel of John, when Jesus finds out that Lazarus is sick, and it says Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. They were 3 of his closest friends. They visited regularly. So we know, although this teaching was difficult, we know that Jesus had Martha's best interests at heart. We know he appreciated her making dinner too, but he's trying to say that what's most important here is that, spending time with God, this is the Son of God. This is God in the flesh right here at your house. And so there's a better way. He's there in person. And so what could they do to really prioritize being with him?
Right. Yeah. And you have to wonder, what did you feed the King of King and Lords of Lords? I mean, what
Prime rib because he's the
right?
ruler. I don't know.
I don't know. So I mean, what would you do, and how would you have to prepare it? And how would Mary I mean, Martha and, Mary, because I do believe that Mary probably was helping, right? I believe that in my heart of hearts, I don't think that she was lazy. I think she was
No.
there helping. I think she was preparing. But when Jesus arrived, she
Mhm.
stopped, right? She
Mm.
stopped what she was doing and went to what was most important. And so, I think that's what we have to really understand. But I know the times when we have had parties at my house or we've hosted events at my house. And I'm sitting there and I am running around trying to make this elaborate, you know,
Mm.
um, you know, ex- 4-course meal, right? Or 3-course meal or whatever. And my husband's just sitting there watching TV. And I'm like, why aren't you helping me? Um, and so, I think part of the problem is, Leanna, you don't have to make a 4-course meal. Your
Mm.
friends would probably be happy with some chips and some French fries and some hamburgers and hot dogs.
Mhm.
I think what the problem is that we make it more complicated than it needs to be. And that's probably what Martha was doing.
Yes.
Probably trying, she knew who Jesus was. She knew who he was. And so she wanted to do everything for him and put out the best for him. But sometimes I think Jesus just is saying to us, I don't need all the fancy bells and
Mhm.
whistles. Keep it simple. Just give me what is, he was a humble guy. He never really wanted a whole bunch. The problem is we live in a world where you have to have this charcuterie board that is, all fancy and laid out and looks like this design, right? And you've got to have these really impressive meals and table settings and all sorts of stuff. And so I think we get caught up. And I think Jesus would have been happy with PB&J, right? If they'd had those back then. Um, we just overdo things. I know I do. And
Mm.
so I
Yeah.
think we just need to learn to be content with simplicity so that our hearts and minds can focus on him.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it could have been like, okay, so let's say they're working ahead and Mary probably was helping. They get to a certain point, it could have been that Martha would say, like, okay, so everything's not ready, but you're here, Jesus. So, what should we do? And it could have been that, they just all gather in the kitchen and just throw something together because the important part was that they're together. And
Yeah.
so let's just focus on that. And when we going back to this whole, like, what are their priorities and making time for what matters most. The beauty of all that is that when we do design our schedule according to our priorities and it's less cluttered, we have so much more peace because we have some margin. It's
Yeah.
not all crammed full.
Yeah.
We're
And when you
both
do it simply, it gives you more margin.
yes. Absolutely, yes. Like, okay, yeah, ideally, we would have a four-course meal and my kitchen and all the food would look like the Pinterest page. But I'm not gonna do that right now because I wanna prioritize time with my guests. I wanna prioritize, Jesus is at my house. So talking about margins, we're both avid readers and authors, and I saw this great parallel. It said, look, okay, so let's imagine that we're reading a book, but in this book, all the words, they start at the very top of the page, they go all the way to the bottom, and they go from one side to the other of the page. There is literally no white space
Mm.
because I want to get as many words on the page as I can, right? Because,
Mhm.
maximum well, that would be really hard to read, is we
Oh, yeah.
need those white spaces in order
Mhm.
to make the words stand out more. So it's like our lives, the meat of our lives is the stuff in the middle, but without those margins, the meat doesn't it's just too much. And so I
Yeah.
think figuring out those margins are so important. And I found this quote recently that I just love. Courtney Carver, I didn't look up who she is, but she says, "I don't say no because I am so busy. I say no because I don't want to be so busy."
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
just love that.
I actually had the privilege of interviewing her,
Oh, really?
for one of her, last book releases, and,
Oh,
she
good to
actually
know.
suffers from MS, and so
Mm,
one of her, things was to, figure out how she could build more margin in her life and the difference that it
mm,
made for her. So highly encourage if anybody wants to go read her books. She tells her story. But yeah, I definitely want to. We need that rest. We need that
yes.
space to rest. Whether it's our eyes, it's our minds, or our bodies. Rest is
Mm.
so important. And that's the only way we're going to get that rest is by building margin to our lives.
That's so good. I'm so glad you have a connection with her. That
Yes.
makes the quote even more special. That's wonderful. Um, and we're always wanting to go back to the Bible, and I love that God set the precedent for having a margin from the beginning of time. If you think about creation, God, with His breath, creates the whole universe. Like, mind blown there. So 6 days He creates everything, and like in the first episode, we talked about an order. He created with order, but on the seventh day He rested. Did He rest because He was tired? He probably doesn't get tired, but He was setting a precedent of having margin.
Mm,
And just in case we didn't get it, just knowing about the creation, He established something called the Sabbath.
yeah.
In Exodus, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And so that precedent He set for us to have one day a week where we don't work, where we put all those to-do lists aside, and we spend time resting and time with Him. And it's just such a beautiful example that God set of margin. He
Yeah.
knows that we are best, most healthy physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally when we have margin in our lives.
Yeah. And he knows that, and he calls us to that rest.
Mhm,
He says in Matthew 11:28-30, "Come to me, all you who are weary and
mhm,
burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And so when
mm,
we take that time to rest and use it for the purpose that it was, which is to, spend time with the Lord. And sometimes you can have a daily Sabbath, you can have a weekly Sabbath, but when we have that with Him in true rest, not only do we have a better understanding of what we need to be doing, but we exchange our weariness for His comfort and rest. And I think that's the
mhm.
perfect definition of a life with margin.
Yes, that's so good, and I'm so glad that you mentioned not just weekly Sabbath, but daily Sabbath. Not that it's a, specific, you know, book, chapter, verse that we can point to, but Jesus regularly took time to spend with God. God knows that we need margin, not just if you look at the calendar of the month or the calendar of the week for the Sabbath, but every day needs some margin in
Mm,
it. That's the
yeah,
way that we are most healthy. And
yeah,
so setting that precedent in Scripture for us is just so helpful. So
definitely.
building rest
Definitely.
into that schedule.
All right. Well, we've crammed a lot into this episode.
Yeah, we just
Even though
talking about not cramming too
we're
much.
I know, right? We've crammed a lot in there. So let's quickly give our listeners a review of what we did
Yes.
talk about, in case we can let their brain rest a bit.
Yes. So a cluttered schedule leaves us feeling stressed out and stretched like that butter scraped over too much bread. And that's not a healthy lifestyle. God knows it, and He has a better plan. And that better plan involves taking a really close up look at our calendar, our to do list, and getting rid of things that don't match our priorities. Um, God set a precedent for margin in our lives when He created the world, took a day to rest, and created the Sabbath, and told us to, shape our lives accordingly. And a life with margins gives us peace, and that peace is priceless. So that's the overall what we covered today, and hopefully our listeners will find this helpful.
Yeah, and encouraging. And
Yes.
I was just thinking while you were talking about that, I just thought about, just how God just wants to, comfort us and and help us along the way. So I had another thought, but of course, like everything else, my brain, it goes away. So maybe I'll come back with it another episode.
Yeah.
So, but that is it for this episode of Uncluttered. We love to hear from you. Please connect with us. You can reach out at contact@uncluttered.faith. We want to hear from you, whether you've got some tips, some advice, you just want to share what you think about the podcast. We'd love to hear from you, but even better, we'd love it if you could leave a rating or a review, because that's
Mhm.
how people help us and find us even more. And our goal is to get to 25 ratings and reviews. So if you could just drop us a quick little line and let us know how that's working for you, we would really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. And share with if there's probably there have been people as well as yourself, I'm guessing, but people that come to mind, so and so, they would really think they would really enjoy that. I think they would find value. Share it with
Yeah.
them. I regularly talk about podcasts that I love. I'm kind of a podcast junkie, so I'm always talking about this podcast, that podcast. The joy of sharing it with them, it's all free. It's great information. And that's really probably the best way that people find podcasts is just a personal share. So
Yeah.
appreciate you listening. We love having you as an audience. And until next time, I want to remind you that an uncluttered life is an abundant life.